This podcast is intended for entertainment and informational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the business psychos and does not reflect the viewpoints of their current or former employers or clients. Thank you.
It's the business cycles, and today we're gonna talk it out. The podcast about what execs shouldn't talk about. Connecting executives and those who aspire. We're here to have a conversation, yeah, we're gonna light the fire. It's the business cycles. Yeah. The business cycles.
And we are the Business Psychos podcast, where we discuss how to navigate the complexity of corporate culture in modern life without becoming a psycho. I'm Mary.
And I'm Katie.
Hey, Katie.
How's it going?
There is actually really important news, right? We dropped our first episode today, and that's just so exciting. I'm really excited.
Yeah,
we have a
podcast. We are podcasters now.
And I'm looking forward to today. As always, we have another juicy topic.
We do have a juicy topic.
And like some of our other topics, we're starting with a term which is frequently parlayed around the halls of corporate America and LinkedIn. We're going to talk about the growth mindset and what it means for you. I want to first unpack what is meant by growth mindset. This can mean something different if you are an employer versus an employee. It may even mean something entirely different outside of the business world. I'm thinking, for example, the head of a department at a private university may use the term growth mindset very differently from the head of HR at a major corporation.
This is another example where corporate jargon is used in a vague and unhelpful way to cover a less appealing reality. For this episode, the differences in our background will give this discussion a lot of dimension. You come from enterprise corporate and I come from high growth tech. I think it's important for this discussion because tech culture and innovation, in air quotes, along with its pace, has informed a lot of what corporate environments are now experiencing. This is where rugged individualism has been justified and the pace of the market has sped up, leading to what is ubiquitously called growth mindset. What does the term mean?
So the generic definition online is a growth mindset is the belief that a person's abilities can be improved through effort, learning, and persistence. It's about how a person approaches challenges, processes failures, and adapts as a result. People with a growth mindset believe that their abilities can be developed and improved over time. So I don't disagree with this definition, but it feels to me, Katie, that there's some missing subtext. And for me, coming again from bigger corporate, three things come to mind when I hear growth mindset. I hear no more jobs for life, and I hear employees are accountable for continually assessing their value in the workforce. I hear employees are responsible for acquiring the skills necessary to remediate any gap between their value and current market needs.
2 and 3 kind of break my heart, seeing the shift in personal responsibility for development shift to the employee in the 30 years I've been working. Combine this with the unpredictable shifting of needs for skills and the current pace of innovation. This is so punishing to people. This feels maybe a little early to be getting into something as dry as employment law, but here we are. In the US, with at-will employment, this puts employees in such a position where they're always walking on eggshells to a certain extent. And most countries in the world require employers to dismiss employees only for cause. In the US, at-will means an employer can change the terms of the employment relationship with no notice, no consequences. Even jobs typically covered under union contracts, like those in manufacturing, I've seen US jobs transition overseas for years now. So with the technological innovation of the last 20 years, we now see white collar jobs for life going away, if not completely gone.
I'm thinking as AI progresses, this is going to affect every single job. Right now, I personally see two groups affected: the jobs which oversee the manual processes, and then the middle layer supervisory roles, which are purely managerial.
I use AI for a lot of things and I love it. I
Me
see
too.
the skill with AI is the ability to create the commands that you input into the system that will yield the best output. It reminds me of having super smart people who work for you. You give them a directive and they return with really good work, and you fine tune it with them to make it excellent. Now with AI, the turnaround time is minutes versus days. The detail of the work is excellent, and most of what you tune for is stylistic and tone based. The first group you mentioned that oversees manual processes is going to be seriously impacted with the advancement in AI. Like tech is already citing cost savings, usually meaning layoffs, as one of AI's benefits. So for example, if you've been, say, like a procurement manager for the last 10 years, and now systems and tools can do your job, you're going to be stuck in a difficult position.
Imagine that there's a woman named Agnes and she's a manager in procurement at a mid to large size company. I like to envision Agnes because she's great at her job. She's been there for a while. She knows how to navigate all the various policies and manual procedures that no one understands. And she also knows how to use and help others use the company's probably user unfriendly procurement platform, which isn't integrated with any other system. And I'm imagining when this company hired Agnes, they were not advertising for someone with a growth mindset in the job spec.
Back then, they wouldn't have been able to imagine what the technical landscape would be like in 10 years or so. They'd want somebody with attention to detail, knowledge of procurement, and the personality to do that kind of job. But let's talk about the personality. The mindset is mechanical. You wanted someone who is functional, reliable, consistent, didn't make mistakes. You didn't want someone interested in disruption of any kind. You wanted the function to produce a predictable output.
Absolutely. They're not looking to pay someone with the aptitude and interest to make the entire procurement function more efficient, because that in effect would result in fixing yourself right out of a job.
Right. Ideally, you'd have a company culture where they look for talented people with the ability to improve. But as you say, if the role is highly manual, bureaucratic, and low paying, that's not what's happening. Flash forward 10 years, and the same company is now talking about being growth minded, which means Agnes needs to figure out what she's going to do next. And since we're ultimately talking about shaping your career in this episode, I'll talk briefly about the stages of a company and the personality characteristics that can be helpful for folks trying to navigate decision-making processes in their career transitions. I'm not going to emphasize the economics and the funding stages, rather the stage of growth and the personalities that tend to be well suited. In tech, you have early stage, it's sometimes called seed, the proof of concept stage of a company, where it is super high risk tolerance. The rule of thumb, it's usually about 50 people. The people who are in the company are really averse to highly structured environments. They're really creative, they're swashbucklers, they're mavericks. The company grows and succeeds. These are people that will fight the progress of creating process that's necessary for the actual scaling of the company. So when you are part of these early seed stages, one of the most challenging things is some of the beloved people in the company when you're transitioning into a larger stage of your growth is that these people have to be worked with in a way that can be really honestly sad. It's a tough one because they're so important for growing the company. Next is growth, often called venture funded in the tech world. This is mid risk tolerance, usually 70 to about 500 people for the earlier stage of growth. Later stage is getting into the thousands. So it's often called venture funded because it means it's taking on money to hire more people. But ultimately, the reason it's venture funded is that there are folks that want to invest in the potential future profitable exit. That means they want the company to have scalable processes that make it market ready. For people that really like taking chaos and starting to form some order, but can function in chaos, but have a proclivity for creating order, I am one of those people. This is a really ideal stage for a company. But then, of course, you've got the late stage mature companies, a lower risk tolerance profile. But this is where process has been refined to the point that you get bureaucracy and the lunacy. But what people tend to not understand is that the more people you bring into the group, the more people you have to account for. So, so your efficiency goes down, but it's just how it works. One example I have about the difference between the mature company and the earlier stages of companies. My first job out of college was for Eli Lilly, a Fortune 100 blue chip company. And I was a kid right out of college. They had a relocation department that sent me a preloaded credit card for expenses. There was also onboarding. I got this red carpet moving van that came and packed my boxes and moved me to Boston. And by the way, the things they packed when I arrived in Boston and opened the boxes up, it was just a bunch of college kitchen junk.
It's like plastic plates they're wrapping into newspaper and stuff.
couple old crusty ramen noodles. It was like, whoa. And there's no room. It's a city apartment coming from New Hampshire. It was a big pile of garbage that basically they'd moved from one location to another that found its way to the curb in Boston. It was just white glove. And how exciting that was for me. Compare that to a software company. My first year there, we were the Inc. 500's top growth software company. I was relocating to Europe and I was director level at this point. Not only did I have to fulfill my job function, I also had to do all of the visa processing and figure out how to do all of the paperwork and understand all the legal implications of moving to another country, do all of my relocation, all of my finding a place to live. I had to negotiate the package in terms of like my relocation compensation. I had to negotiate my contract in terms of my return package and tax equalization. And I had to learn about all that stuff and fend for myself while doing my job. So when you're talking about company size, and that's a mid-sized company, and I would say seed stage definitely would be on steroids. I'd say I kind of preferred the white glove version, to be honest.
Yes, same.
The one thing I would mention is that as it relates to corporate companies, talking about Agnes, the writing has been on the wall about adopting these high-speed innovation notions into large corporations. The introduction of innovation hubs, creating these sort of siloed organizations that are culturally completely differentiated. And by the way, how those innovations integrate with the larger company is a whole other story, which winds up being highly politicized and rendering the innovation hub ineffective, is that the introduction of the idea that this early stage style of growth is supposed to be adopted by people who are adapted and better suited for large company life.
Rules like adapt and survive, capitalism's second commandment. Right. All of us will need to adapt sooner or later. None of us are going to be able to stay in a job that doesn't require some ongoing learning of some kind. Group which has been impacted by the no jobs for life tenet are what I call the pure middle managers. And I've seen this in probably 10 years as organizations shift to player coach models or agile teams. They start to make better use of technology, which monitors, manages, and extracts performance metrics for their employees. And all of those things used to be done with those traditional middle managers. I think these folks are going to have a greater challenge ahead of them than Agnes because they've been focused on supervising the doers versus being a doer.
Okay, what about everyone else?
I mean, you said it earlier, technology is just steaming ahead. I don't know if we even have the capacity to really understand what's in store. What isn't new, of course, are needing fewer people to run things as you optimize processes. It reminds me of the childhood game of musical chairs. It's so stressful. Yeah. As organizations evolve and become less manual, there are just fewer jobs. And so for sake of argument, let's say Agnes's company doesn't yet have the technology to remove all humans from procurement, but they have made some digital advancements to where they only need 2 Agneses instead of 6.
Oh my God, musical chairs. When you really take yourself back to that feeling of the anxiety of like, who's going to get a seat?
It's a terrible
It's
game, by the way. Can we just say that that's a really horrible childhood game?
Oh
There's like
my
some
God.
music and everyone's kind of like crouching. And then what happens as soon as the music stops, you elbow the two people nearest you out of the way, you scooch yourself under, you push them out of the chair. It's horrible.
Remember the whole game while you're circling, it's turning everyone into this adversarial vulture that would just like eat the young of the other kids that you're playing with.
Yes.
Because you're listening to music and you're looking at open chairs and you're calculating all that. What were we being trained for? It definitely, I don't think it like maybe it got me ready for anything other than just maybe hard coding a little low grade anxiety into me. When you're talking about downsizing, where a company needs 2 of the Agneses, not the 6 previously required, which Agneses get to keep their jobs.
This is a complicated one. It's probably worth its own episode at some point. But the concept up or out comes to mind. In fact, sometimes up or out can even be associated with high performing cultures. So the company has 6 Agneses, but it only needs 2. So unless there were some really clear cut and dry performance issues across those 6 employees, most likely the company would do a reduction in force, and they would need to define the go forward criteria for the new procurement role. And then they would need to assess those 6 Agneses against that and determine who had the skills which better matched the new role.
Many years ago, I joined a company to optimize a team. And I could take this in the direction of talking about employment law, but I have something else I want to highlight. So in the interview process, I was sold a really sunny organization. But when I started, I was presented with a very different proposition, a dramatic restructuring. I bring this up because the CEO gave me his philosophy on the approach he wanted me to take, and it stayed with me forever. He said, assess each person as follows. If they are performing but are not a culture fit, keep them until their performance slips. If they're a culture fit and performing, no brainer, keep them. But culture fit and non-performing, keep and find another place for them in the organization. Now, reminder of the nod to employment law at the top of this anecdote, which is why I'll end the story here. But the thing that I took away from that and why that meeting left my jaw smacking the floor, he clearly outlined culture fit over everything, especially at that point in my career where I had absolutely ravaged myself to be high performing, even to the expense of my ability to show up and have cultural and political acumen. That shocked me. And that realization, it was like a collision. So the thing is, what was this culture fit? I remember noticing, why are all the people he presented as an example of not having it old or uncool? And in my experience, the ones which don't make the cut can sometimes be the oldest. I think it's fair to say that ageism can come into play here, and we'll come back to it. The company may not be preparing Agnes for this shift. Recall the notion of rugged individualism, where it's on her to be prepared for shifts that she can't predict, and at a pace with the market moving so fast, it would be impossible to expect her to. And she can be doing a great job for 15 years, and then suddenly, boom, we need somebody with different skills. If there isn't even a heads up, Agnes could be completely caught off guard.
We do have an episode on ageism scheduled, and I think you made some really interesting points. If these kinds of exercises that we're talking about, if they're not done with consistent guidelines, and HR is usually involved in the process to ensure that it is, for obvious reasons, then I think ageism can absolutely exist. And as far as Agnes being caught off guard, you mentioned heartbreaking at the top of the episode. I'm kind of slipping into my intellectual mode of doing the podcast, but this is a very emotional topic. And there are a lot of people out there who are scared, who are struggling. And I want to often come back in the podcast to that because I get into my head a lot, and I want to talk about the experience of Agnes and others like her out there. While some organizations do have formal job transition programs, others do not. If you're lucky, you might be in a large organization that has almost like a university platform, and they will preload that platform with skills and curriculum that they know that they need. to start to proactively transition employees over. You see this in spaces like agile, data, cyber, engineering roles. But if a company doesn't have something like this and no one hints or even has a very quiet, informal, off the record word with Agnes, then she can really be caught off guard. So in my mind, the term growth mindset can be used to convey to employees that the responsibility is on them to continually adapt and survive in a constantly changing market.
As somebody who has built teams from the ground up, one of the things that I can speak to personally doing is figuring out what you need. And I think that when innovation in larger companies is starting to match this rapid adaptation to a market that's constantly changing, it's this disadvantage of nobody being able to really prepare for this shift. And the fact that this current climate always puts the onus on the employee and takes them at face value about whether they can fulfill the current need without a larger context to do with historical service and long-term responsibility for their well-being. When I build teams, I'm very lean early on until I figure out what should be scaled, because also from the very practical end of this is that if you're building an organization and you overhire in the early stages where you're establishing culture and morale, and then you have to cut people, it really puts back the momentum and the progress, understandably, and as it should. So being really mindful of who you're bringing on when you're building a team. Switching gears here, so for the employer's perspective, they're going to use these exercises to release people whose value has not kept pace with change. It's a reduction in headcount, but it's also a culling to address talent stagnation, or what is uncharitably referred to as cutting dead wood.
Workforce management, of which there's many, many roles posted, is neither art nor science or any combination. It seems like companies just back of the envelope, or they don't align their strategy and change programs to workforce management. Those three things are completely divorced and siloed from one another without even any integration of tooling. And it's so common, it's shocking. And you would say, well, wait a minute, you have an annual strategy planning process. You have an annual capital planning process. What's important? What are our priorities? What are we going to do? When do we need it done? How many people do we need to do it? And then everyone goes, right. And then there's a whole separate other workforce management that has nothing to do with those things. And there's no accountability. And last minute, we've dumped this big program or product or whatever. And then, hey, doesn't that fix the headcount over here, or vice versa? You end up onboarding and releasing people. And like yourself, I worked in Europe and am familiar with different European labor laws, which are much more complicated and rigid than ours in the US. And you don't do that there, because if you do that there, it's really, really going to bite you and it's going to be problematic. And my somewhat cynical view is, if there were those types of consequences here, people might be much more careful with workforce management, maybe not for an ethical reason, a moral reason, but because it's going to be really, really difficult to then get rid of those people. Whereas here, it's not.
The first 30 days of employment, where that's the only time that you could literally fire somebody so at will, it's shocking in the UK. And then after that, you're slowly transitioning into this thing where it's like, we can't break this, or you can bring me up on tribunal.
You're going to end up paying them for the job anyway when you're done.
Yeah.
So you might as well keep them on the payroll and have them doing it, because it is going to be so painful and costly.
When I went to Europe, seeing the 14-page document, and realizing this is legally binding. And if I step against these, I am putting the company at risk, because we could be taken up. You don't even know it's happening. You're just served notice. It's like, hey, you asked me to work to 5:30. That's not above board.
Absolutely. When we come back, we're going to talk about being accountable for assessing your value.
talking about growth mindset. We have established that most jobs in the US are at will, and there are few to no jobs for life anymore. Because of this, having growth mindset means you understand that you alone are accountable for continuously assessing your value relative to a company's needs. I cringe as I say this because I don't believe people's value is based on how they can serve a company's bottom line, but that is the hard reality.
Yes, adapt and survive. I think honesty and self-reflection are critical here. Maybe Agnes reads an article on LinkedIn about the high demand for cyber jobs. And it's like, okay, but Agnes is going to need to sit and assess whether she has the skills, interest, and mindset to transition to be successful in a cyber job. She may be a great match. She's detail oriented. She likes to read and take in information and organize it. So possibly Agnes enrolls in a certification course or attends night school, and that's awesome. But I would personally advise Agnes not to start with the jobs which are in demand, but to start with her own strengths, skill sets, interests, and work style, and then look at jobs which align to those.
Let's talk about it. So back in the day, there was a book, What Color is Your Parachute?, which helped young people figure out what they should do for a living. True story. Someone gave me a copy when I was burning out from working 100-hour work weeks in tech. And as I was reading it, it started pointing me in the direction of becoming a teacher. And at the time, a pay cut was so revolting to me that I considered the book an existential threat and hid it somewhere out of view. It can be helpful to uncouple meaning and purpose from livelihood. And what I mean by this is to consider that you can work a job that bankrolls a passion. This is something, Mary, you've spoken to in an earlier episode. It's not really necessary for every employee to be completely finding their meaning directly from the company's objectives. You have people who are supporting families, and that has them show up and give 100% every day and bring their A game. Some of the best professionals with the most consistent attitudes and performance have been people who are doing it because they're supporting families. I think it's important to uncouple some of this stuff and also consider you can have a passion that is not revenue generating. So there's also the process for figuring out the type of problems your brain likes to solve. This is something I had worked on and certainly not perfected with thousands of people in a previous role. Consider the types of challenges your brain finds satisfying, maybe like math and logic problems that don't involve a lot of human psychology. So certain engineering and coding work could be great. You're competitive and you like psychology. So sales, you like decorating, aesthetics, and making things functional for people to use. So maybe UX and UI for web properties. I mean, this is grazing the tip of the iceberg, but hopefully paints a picture. Some folks like the Bill Burnett and Dave Evans book, Design Your Life, for kind of working through some of this stuff. But I do like the Japanese concept of ikigai. So it translates to reason for being. It's a method for determining the work that will fulfill you. The vocational guidance model has the 4 circles. And maybe you've seen it, the Venn diagram, where you have 4 circles. One is what you love, what the world needs, your skills, and what you can be paid for. And the cross section would be your ikigai.
So cat cuddler is probably not something I can be paid for. I guess that's, I was just going through the math.
That's a passion you're bankrolling with a soul-sucking job.
Love this concept. I almost feel like it's related to why I'm doing this podcast, Katie, thinking about how to bridge these different things, thinking about your passions and missions along with what's practical for getting paid and supporting yourself. I wish I saw something like that when I was starting off. I actually didn't have the parachute book when I was starting off at all. I don't know what was going on with my counseling at university, but
I think I just looked so desperate that people were like, how do we help this woman?
Books. I'm wondering if ikigai is it's a bridge between, we just did this episode on mental health in the workplace. And so I like thinking about ikigai as a bridge between that episode and mental wellness. And then this one on growth mindset. If you're the person who loves nature and working with your hands and designing and creating, then maybe an office job isn't right for you. And pushing yourself into a life which is greatly misaligned from who you really are is probably going to be detrimental to your mental health over
Yep,
time.
that's
I'd
it.
argue that that person might struggle to be successful in that office job anyway. So why stay there and double down on training and rediscovering yourself in that environment?
While the disruptions we're talking about in the business world can seem scary, they also present an opportunity for employees to move to a job better suited to them. I'd advise Agnes to use her LinkedIn network, ask for some introductions to people doing jobs she wants. There's something I call inspiration hunting. Find and talk to people who love what they do without needing this to be a transaction, without needing to get something directly out of it, an introduction, a job opportunity. Talk with people who inspire you and look for insights. Energy and excitement is essential for this kind of process. So it can be really challenging and emotionally demanding. So finding inspiration for the path ahead is so important. So activate your curiosity, ask a lot of questions, and take time before committing, going in a new direction.
I love that. I love that. That's a great quote. Once you know what you want to do, commit by developing a roadmap to get from where you are to where you want to go. Which brings us to the third area of growth mindset, which is employee driven learning and development. In my mind, and you just said it, Katie, it's critical to be curious and have an enthusiastic mindset because you're probably going to be learning something completely different from anything you've done before. If you're transitioning in midlife, or even maybe before midlife, this can be a very daunting process. You're most likely going to feel nervous and vulnerable, which is normal and very okay.
Yeah, a great strategy is to start with the end. Cultivate the idea of what could be possible if the people that are surrounding you don't really represent possibilities. Going into a process of change is going to become a really mentally and emotionally disruptive process, more so than if you have a sense of optimism for the direction that you're headed in. The surge of emotion and anxiety. I say use these feelings to your advantage. Let them soften you and make you more open to the process from an interpersonal point of view. People will be more likely to help you and give you a break if you're open-minded and eager to challenge your prior ways of thinking. When we are in a vulnerable state with our career, especially if we are in a role that is being down regulated, we'll call it, it can really undermine a person's sense of confidence that something that they're good at is now being considered outdated and not as useful and meaningful. People can get really defensive. Understandably, I've met with people who are, at later stages in their career, who are in need of making some pretty significant transitions. And they're really fortified and defensive. And this is one of the things that really doubles down on ageism when there's this sense that you're not going to be adaptable, increasing your vulnerability and softening yourself, being able to show up in a way that make people see what's possible for you, not have them looking back, because we're looking at the future. So when we come back, we will share our final thoughts on growth mindset.
Katie, I like talking about this topic today. I like that we evolved to talking about an individual's life purpose, which can sometimes run the risk of seeming romantic and impractical. I think each one of us would love to be paid to do the things we care about and enjoy doing. I'm not sure any of this is integrated into career service models in schools and universities, but it should be.
Which is a shame. It really should be. I agree. People shouldn't underestimate the personal growth process either. Growth mindset is about staying relevant to change, but also the process of truly knowing who we are and what inspires us and gives us a sense of accomplishment. Going back to my oft-quoted Thomas Merton, which is getting older is getting to the top of the ladder and realizing you climbed the wrong one, is that these disruptions offer a chance for us to potentially course correct out of a path of regret. It's kind of tough to look at it that way, but where do you find the opportunity? And Mary, you were just talking about some of the statistics, like self-employment and alternative working models and ways of making money.
I don't quote me, we'll do it on our fact checking, but I saw a statistic, it was like 73% of the population now works for a company with fewer than 8 people, which assumes a lot of gig work and assumes some work around passive incomes, like setting up LLCs for real estate and small construction businesses and trade. But I think what we've been talking about, people reconciling who they are, what makes them happy with how do they survive. And some people are starting to look at completely new models.
Human nature is ultimately resilient and seeks its integrity. So when organizations are dehumanizing people, the counterforce is that folks are actually starting to create some really interesting and, quite frankly, amazing options and solutions for themselves.
I had a friend of mine who was at a nonprofit for 22 years and was let go. And it was a culture in a company where people typically had fired there. He was so personally devastated. He was really hurt. He was really sad and felt almost like a betrayal. Tried not to say it in an unempathetic way, but like, what is the universe telling you that there's something even better out there for you? He had been talking about leaving this place for some time, and it was just so comfortable that I thought, well, maybe this is just the little nudge out to get out of that comfort zone that is going to bring you something really magical that you never would have had, the belief in yourself to go out on your own to get, which is why I think that the personal growth process and the professional one is so entwined. And depending on which one maybe starts first and then pushes the other one ahead, hopefully we talked about this on our mental health episode, is that people are talking about what makes them happy and what serves them and what brings out the best version of themselves. And so maybe a lot of the things that we're talking about, I think, are dehumanizing and are cold and cruel and difficult. And I'm trying to believe that maybe it's an opportunity for all of us to then focus a little bit more on other things that might matter more.
It's really understandable to get into a mindset where you're urgently trying to just find a replacement. And this is often where you find yourself going from one bad situation to a worse one out of desperation.
Right. Yes. Back to self-awareness and honesty. And if these things aren't calibrated, you're going to find it hard to adapt with your best interests at heart. Well, this was fun. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Mary. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please like, subscribe, and share with other psychos you know. We'd also love to hear from you, so hit us up on our socials. You can find us on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook under @BusinessPsychosPod. Bye.